They gave her divorce papers instead of a Christmas gift. They put his mistress in her chair, and when they were done humiliating her, she stood up, looked around that table, and said the one sentence none of them understood, until it was far too late. Welcome back to Mr. James Family Returns. I'm your storyteller, James. If you're here, it means you believe, like we do, that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and that the people who overlook us today are often the ones who need us most tomorrow. Before we begin, if this is your first time with us, welcome. Hit that subscribe button, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. And if you're already part of the family, thank you for coming back. Hit like, turn on notifications, and let's get into it. Grab something warm to drink, get comfortable, and let's begin. Humiliation and the first mystery. The candles on the Vaughan family dining table burned low, their light catching the crystal Amara Bennett had polished herself that afternoon. She had been in this kitchen since 7 that morning, basting the turkey, arranging the poinsettias just the way Vivian liked them, wrapping gifts for people who would never think to wrap one for her. She didn't mind. She never had. Or she'd told herself that so many times it had started to feel true. "The gravy needs more time," Vivian Vaughan said, not looking up from her wine glass. It wasn't a request. It was a correction, delivered the way she delivered everything. Smooth, unhurried, impossible to argue with, the kind of comment that made you feel foolish for ever having done it differently. "Of course," Amara said, and went back to the kitchen. She caught her reflection in the dark window above the sink. 5 years married to Ethan, and she still moved through this house like a guest who hadn't been told how long she was allowed to stay. She thought of, not for the first time, of the first Christmas, how nervous she'd been, how she'd stayed up half the night making a pecan pie from her grandmother's recipe because she wanted so badly for them to like her. Vivian had taken one bite and said, "How rustic." Ethan had laughed back then, like it was nothing, like it wasn't the beginning of something. When she carried the gravy boat back into the dining room, the seat beside Ethan was already full. Chloe Hart sat in Amara's chair. Amara's napkin, folded into a swan the way Amara always folded it, now rested beside Chloe's plate. Chloe smiled up at her, not cruel, not even smug, just certain. The smile of someone who already knew how the evening would end, the way you smile at a play whose ending you've already read. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone already knows something except one person. Amara set the gravy boat down without spilling a drop. Her hands were steady. She noticed that about herself, distantly, the way you notice a stranger's composure. "I think that's my seat." "Sit anywhere, dear," Vivian said, gesturing vaguely toward the far end of the table near the kitchen door, where the extra chair always sat during holidays for whichever cousin arrived late. "We won't stand on formality tonight." Ethan said nothing. He looked at his plate, at the untouched roll he'd been tearing into small, useless pieces for the last 5 minutes. That was the moment Amara understood. Not from Chloe's smile, not from Vivian's tone, but from Ethan's silence. In 5 years, she had learned every version of his silence. The comfortable kind, when they lay in bed and didn't need to fill the air. The guilty kind, after he forgot her birthday the 2nd year and didn't know how to apologize. This one was new. This one had already made a decision, and it was simply waiting for the room to catch up to it. Vivian rose, smoothing her skirt, and reached beneath the table linens for a manila envelope Amara hadn't noticed. She placed it in front of Amara's untouched plate with the gentleness of someone setting down a gift, the corners perfectly squared, as if presentation still mattered even here. "We think it's time," Vivian said, "for everyone to be honest about where things stand. This family values honesty above all else." Amara didn't open it, she didn't need to. She had drafted enough documents in her life to recognize the weight of paper before she touched it. The particular density of legal language, the way certain envelopes were made just slightly heavier than they needed to be, as if the paper inside understood its own importance. "Ethan," her voice didn't shake, "is this really what you want?" He finally looked up. For one breath, something flickered behind his eyes. The boy who used to drive 4 hours just to bring her soup when she was sick, who once told her, half asleep, that he'd never met anyone who made silence feel like company instead of absence. Then it was gone, folded away like something he'd decided he could no longer afford to keep. The way you put away a coat that no longer fits the season. Amara, my family and I think it would be best if... That's not an answer, she said it softly, not sharp. Just clear, the way she might correct a typo in a contract. Chloe reached over and rested her hand on Ethan's arm. Small gesture, enormous statement. She wore a dress the exact shade of red Vivian had worn to her own wedding, and Amara understood with a strange, distant clarity that this had not happened by accident. Ethan didn't move his arm away. Amara looked around the table, at Vivian's composed satisfaction, at Chloe's careful patience, at Ethan's father staring hard at his wine glass, as though the answer to all of this might be dissolved somewhere in the cabernet, at Ethan, who could not hold her gaze for more than a second. She had spent 5 Christmases in this house, believing that if she was patient enough, kind enough, good enough, it would eventually be enough. She had believed it through the small comments about her clothes, her modest car, the apartment she'd insisted on keeping in her own name even after they married. She had told herself it was pride, not fear, that kept her from correcting them. Tonight she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that it had never been about being enough. It had been about being seen, and they had never once looked. She stood. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. "Then you have no idea what you've just chosen," she said it quietly, almost gently, the way you might warn a child not to touch something hot, not out of malice, but because some part of her still didn't want to watch them get burned. Nobody at the table understood what she meant. Vivian's mouth curved, faintly amused, as if Amara had said something charmingly dramatic, the sort of line a woman says when she has nothing left but her dignity. Chloe tilted her head, confused but unbothered, already reaching for the wine Amara had chosen for the table. Ethan's father cleared his throat and studied his napkin. Ethan frowned, uncertain whether he'd just been threatened or pitied, and some small, honest part of him didn't like not knowing which. Amara picked up her coat from the back of her chair, folded her napkin, not into a swan this time, just folded, and walked out of the house that had never once in 5 years felt like hers. Behind her, she heard Vivian say brightly to no one in particular, "Well, that went better than I expected." Amara didn't turn around. The drive home took 40 minutes. Amara didn't turn on the radio. She watched the snow catch in her headlights and thought about her grandmother's voice, the one that had been in her head since she was a girl. Money reveals people. It doesn't create who they are. It only shows you what was already there. Evelyn Bennett Rhodes had told her that the week Amara turned 18, standing in the library of the house in Charleston, surrounded by portraits of Bennett Rhodes' ancestors who had built shipping empires, and later quietly bought half the waterfront property on the eastern seaboard before anyone understood what it would be worth. "You will meet people who love you before they know your name," her grandmother had said, her hand resting on Amara's shoulder, the two of them looking out over the harbor that the family had owned, in pieces for 4 generations. "And you will meet people who love your name before they ever bother to know you. The hardest part of your life will be telling the difference. Most people never learn it. You will not have that luxury." Amara had believed, for 5 years, that she'd told the difference correctly. She had met Ethan at a coffee shop near the university, 2 years out of law school herself, wearing a second-hand coat because she liked the way it made people talk to her differently, more easily, without the careful performance that came with a recognizable name. He had spilled his coffee, reaching for a napkin to hand her when hers ran out. He didn't know who she was. For 6 months, he still didn't. She had let herself fall in love with the version of him that existed before he knew, and some nights, lying awake beside him, she wondered if that version had ever really been separate from the one who sat silent at that table tonight, or if she had simply chosen over and over not to look too closely. The apartment, modest, a rental in her own name, nothing that would ever suggest what sat behind it, was dark when she got home. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She went straight to the bedroom closet, knelt down, and pulled back the loose section of carpet she'd installed herself 2 years ago, the kind of thing you learn to do when you've grown up around people who taught you that privacy is not the same as dishonesty. Underneath was a small fireproof lockbox. She hadn't opened it in months. She'd told herself, back in the spring, that she wouldn't need to again for a long time. She had wanted badly for that to be true. Inside, a folder of documents bearing a seal she hadn't looked at directly in a long time. A property deed, the ink of her grandmother's signature still crisp along the bottom margin. A letter, unopened, marked only with a date 6 months in the future. Instructions Amara had promised to follow, and until tonight had quietly hoped she'd never need to open early. And a single business card, cream-colored, embossed, no logo, just a name and a number, Marcus Whitfield, Bennett Rhodes Holdings, Legal and Strategic Affairs. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. It was nearly 11 and she had just watched her marriage end over turkey and gravy. Something made her answer Miss Bennett. A man's voice, calm, formal, the kind of voice trained never to sound urgent even when it was. I apologize for the late call. I wouldn't have reached out tonight if it weren't necessary. We've had movement on the Harbour Crown matter. I think you'll want to see this before Monday. Amara sat very still on the edge of her bed, the lockbox open beside her, snow ticking softly against the window. Tell me, she said. The Vaughan Group filed an aggressive new bid this afternoon, Marcus said. Vivian Vaughan personally signed off on it. Her name is on the letterhead, which tells me she's more invested in this than she's letting the board believe. They're desperate, Miss Bennett. Desperate enough that I don't think they fully understand what they're offering or what it will cost them if it falls through. And they still have no idea whose signature stands between them and that property. Amara looked down at the deed in her lap, her grandmother's handwriting in the margins, notes in blue ink from a decade ago, a name on the ownership line that no one at that dinner table would have recognized, because no one at that dinner table had ever once asked who she really was. They had asked what she did for a living, and she'd told them, truthfully, that she consulted on real estate matters. They had never asked which properties. They had never wondered why a woman who supposedly came from nothing, carried herself the way she did, spoke the way she did, understood contract law well enough to catch the mistakes their own family attorney made. How long do we have? She asked. Their board meets in 3 weeks to finalize a decision on Harbour Crown's next phase. If we don't respond, they'll assume silence means the property isn't available at any price, and they'll pursue alternative acquisition strategies, some of which won't be pleasant for the current tenants along that stretch of coastline. I'd recommend we schedule something before then. Draft a response, Amara said. Nothing that reveals anything yet. Just enough to keep them at the table, understood. A pause, careful, the kind lawyers use when they're about to say something outside their job description. Mrs. Bennett, if you don't mind me asking, are you all right? Amara looked at her own reflection in the dark window, the coat still on, the snow still falling outside. I will be, she said, and meant it more than she expected to. She closed the lockbox. Outside, the snow kept falling, gentle and indifferent, over a city that had no idea what had just walked out of a Christmas dinner and back into its own name. Her phone buzzed again. A text this time, from a number saved only as Grandma E.I. heard. Come to Charleston this week. It's time you knew the rest. Amara stared at the message for a long moment. The rest. Not the property. Not Harbour Crown. Something else. Something her grandmother had never mentioned in 12 years of quiet phone calls and careful letters. Something apparently serious enough to have waited for a night exactly like this one. She thought about the unopened letter still sitting in the lockbox, the one marked 6 months in the future, and wondered, with a small chill that had nothing to do with the cold coming through the window, whether her grandmother had somehow known this night was coming long before Amara did. For the first time in 5 years, Amara Bennett allowed herself a small, quiet smile in the dark. They thought they had ended something tonight. They had no idea it was only beginning. False victory and deeper betrayal. 3 weeks after Christmas, Ethan Vaughan stood in the corner office his father had promised him since he was 22, looking out at a view of the harbour he still didn't officially own, and felt, for the first time in months, like a man whose life was finally arranging itself the way it was supposed to. Chloe had moved into the guest wing of the Vaughan estate within days of the divorce filing. Vivian's suggestion, framed as practicality. No sense paying rent on 2 households when we're this close to finalizing everything, she'd said, and Ethan hadn't questioned it, because questioning his mother had never gotten him anywhere except further from what he wanted. What he wanted, more than he'd ever admitted out loud, was Harbour Crown. It wasn't just a project. It was the thing that would finally make the partners at Vaughan Development stop introducing him as Richard's son and start introducing him by his own name. 200 acres of waterfront, zoned for the kind of luxury development that would put Vaughan Development on a national map instead of a regional one. His father had chased it for 6 years and failed. If Ethan could close it, he wouldn't just inherit the company someday, he'd have earned it. The problem, as it had always been, was the ownership. The property sat under a holding company so carefully structured that even Vaughan's own attorneys, after months of digging, had only ever found a name, Bennett Rhodes Holdings, attached to a P.O. box in Charleston, and an attorney named Marcus Whitfield, who answered every inquiry with the same maddening courtesy and gave away nothing. "They're playing hard to get," Vivian said, sweeping into his office without knocking, a habit she'd never broken since he was a boy. She set a folder on his desk. "Or they're not playing at all, and they simply don't want to sell. Either way, I think it's time we stopped being polite about it." "Mother, we've sent 4 offers to a P.O. box," Vivian said. "You don't negotiate with an address, Ethan. You negotiate with a person. Find out who actually sits behind Bennett Rhodes and negotiate with them directly. Everyone has a price or a weakness. Usually both." Ethan almost laughed. It was such a familiar sentence. He'd heard some version of it his whole life, applied to business deals, to social clubs, to the woman he'd married and then unmarried in the space of one dinner. Everyone has a price or a weakness. He wondered, distantly, whether his mother had ever once said it about him and been right. Amara sat in her grandmother's library in Charleston, the same room where, 12 years earlier, she'd first learned what her family name actually meant, and listened as Evelyn Bennett Rhodes told her the rest. "The Vaughans aren't chasing Harbour Crown because they want a shoreline," Evelyn said, pouring tea with hands that shook slightly now, though her voice hadn't lost an ounce of its steel. "They're chasing it because Richard Vaughan made promises to his investors 6 years ago that he still hasn't kept, and his company is closer to trouble than anyone outside that boardroom knows. Harbour Crown isn't ambition, sweetheart. It's survival. And Vivian knows it better than her husband does. How do you know all this?" "Because I've been watching that family for longer than you have," Evelyn said. "Since before you married into it." Something in her grandmother's tone made Amara set down her cup. "What does that mean?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the same harbour she'd shown Amara all those years ago. "It means your grandfather did business with Richard Vaughan's father, decades ago, and it did not end well for our family. It means when you told me you were marrying a Vaughan, I had reasons to worry that I didn't tell you, because you were happy, and I didn't want to be the reason you doubted him before he'd had the chance to disappoint you on his own." Amara felt something cold move through her chest. "You knew who I was marrying into, and you let me walk in blind." "I let you walk in with your eyes open the way I raised you to," Evelyn said gently. "I never once believed Ethan Vaughan was cruel enough to do what his mother would ask of him. I was wrong about that. I'm sorry for it. But I was not wrong about Vivian." She reached across the small table and took Amara's hand. "There is more to tell you, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what to do with Harbour Crown. But not tonight. Tonight, I just need you to know that none of this, not one piece of it, happened to you by accident." Amara didn't sleep well that night. She lay awake thinking about the word accident, turning it over, wondering how far back the thread actually went. Back in the city, the illusion of a new life assembled itself quickly around Ethan and Chloe. Vivian hosted a dinner to formally introduce Chloe to the wider family circle, Cowsons, business partners, the kind of people whose opinions mattered to the Vaughan name. Chloe wore ivory. She laughed at the right moments, complimented the right people, and by the end of the evening Ethan's aunt was already asking, half joking, when they'd set a date. "Give it time," Vivian said, smiling, steering the conversation exactly where she wanted it. "But I will say, Chloe understands this family in a way that took some people rather a long time to learn." It was a small comment. No one else seemed to notice the edge under it. Ethan noticed and said nothing, the way he'd said nothing for months now whenever his mother drew a quiet comparison between Chloe and the woman she'd replaced. Later that night, alone in what used to be his and Amara's bedroom before the locks were changed and her things were boxed and shipped to a storage unit he'd paid for and never visited, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't let himself do in weeks, looking through old photos on his phone. Amara at their wedding, laughing at something just out of frame. Amara asleep on the couch during a thunderstorm, a law textbook open on her chest even in sleep. Amara in the kitchen of their first apartment, badly burning a pot of rice and pretending she'd meant to. He didn't understand, even now, exactly when he'd stopped seeing her and started seeing only what his mother saw. He told himself it had crept up slowly. Some nights, lying next to Chloe, he suspected it hadn't crept at all, that he'd simply stopped fighting it the moment it became easier not to. He put the phone away and didn't look again. 2 weeks later, Marcus Whitfield called Amara with news that made her sit up straight at her desk. "They've escalated," he said. "Vivian Vaughn hired a private research firm to trace the ownership structure behind Bennett Rhodes. They haven't found you yet. The trust is airtight, and it will hold. But they've found enough to know the holding company is run by a single controlling family, not a consortium. That narrows their curiosity considerably. I'd expect more aggressive outreach soon." "Let them look," Amara said. "There's nothing to find that I haven't already decided to show them in my own time." "There's something else," Marcus said, and his voice shifted, careful in a way she'd learned meant he was choosing his words. "In the course of the investigation, our security team flagged an old filing, a business dispute from 18 years ago, involving your grandfather and Richard Vaughn's father. It was settled quietly, out of court, and sealed. I don't have full access to it, but I thought you should know it exists, in case it becomes relevant." Amara thought of her grandmother's face the night before, the careful way she'd said it did not end well for our family, and the sense, growing now with each new piece, that she had walked into this marriage carrying a history she'd never been told existed. "Find out what you can," she said, quietly. "And Harbour Crown, they've requested a formal meeting. Their attorney reached out this morning, very courteous, very eager. They're proposing next month in person with what they're calling the principal decision-maker from Bennett Rhodes." Amara looked out her office window at the city, grey under a low winter sky, and felt the shape of a decision she'd been circling for weeks finally settle into place. "Set the meeting," she said. "Tell them I'll attend personally." There was a pause on the line. "Mrs. Bennett, are you certain, once you're in that room?" "I'm certain," Amara said. "They've spent 3 weeks looking for someone to negotiate with. It's time I let them find her." The Vaughns received the confirmation on a Friday afternoon, and the mood in the office shifted almost immediately. Richard Vaughn, who had said little about Harbour Crown in months beyond tired instructions to keep trying, actually smiled when Vivian told him. "They're sending their principal," Vivian said, setting the confirmation email on his desk like a trophy. "Whoever's been hiding behind that P.O. box for 6 years is finally coming to the table. This is it, Richard. This is what we've been waiting for." Ethan, standing in the doorway, felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the day he took over lead negotiations, and understood, for the first time, just how much his father's company actually needed this deal to survive. If he closed Harbour Crown, none of the last few months would matter anymore. Not the whispers among the cousins, not the careful way certain business partners had started asking after his father's health, with a little too much concern in their voices. He would be the one who saved it. "We should celebrate," Chloe said, slipping her arm through his, already imagining he could tell, the version of this story where she stood beside him at the ribbon cutting in 18 months. "This is everything you've been working for." "Not yet," Vivian said, though she was smiling too now, the careful mask she usually wore slipping just slightly at the edges. "We celebrate once the papers are signed. Until then we prepare. I want everyone in that room understanding exactly what's at stake, and exactly how to make this Bennett Rhodes principal feel comfortable enough to say yes." She didn't know, as she said it, how strange those words would sound to her later. Comfortable enough to say yes, as if comfort had ever been what Amara Bennett needed from this family, as if there had ever been a single dinner in 5 years where the Vaughns had made her feel like she belonged at their table. That night, alone in her study, Vivian poured herself a second glass of wine and sat for a long time looking at nothing in particular. There was a name she hadn't let herself think about in almost 2 decades, a name that belonged to a settlement she'd made sure was sealed tightly enough that no one, not even her own son, would ever have reason to find it. She told herself the coincidence meant nothing, Bennett Rhodes was a large, old family, scattered across a dozen business ventures up and down the coast. There was no reason to believe the woman walking into that boardroom next month had anything to do with what happened all those years ago. She told herself that twice more before she went to bed, and didn't fully believe it either time. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and clear. The Vaughan conference room had been arranged with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for prospective investors. Fresh flowers, the good coffee service, a view of the harbour deliberately positioned so their guest would see, out the window, exactly what this deal would eventually become. Richard Vaughan straightened his tie for the third time. Vivian checked her watch. Ethan stood near the window, going over the terms one final time in his head, aware of a strange, nervous energy in his chest that he couldn't fully explain, as if some part of him already sensed that this meeting would matter for reasons that had nothing to do with real estate. At exactly 10 o'clock, the assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Vaughan, your 10 o'clock has arrived." The door opened. For a moment, nobody in that room understood what they were looking at, because the woman walking through it, dressed in quiet, expensive elegance, flanked by an attorney they now recognized as Marcus Whitfield, was someone Vivian Vaughan had spent 5 years training her family to overlook. Ethan's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "Good morning," Amara said, her voice calm, pleasant, unmistakably certain. "I understand you've been trying to reach me." The truth and the power reversal. For 3 full seconds, no one in the Vaughan conference room said anything at all. Richard Vaughan set down his coffee cup so carefully it made almost no sound. Ethan hadn't moved from the window, his hand still frozen halfway to his mouth, his mind trying and failing to reconcile the woman standing in the doorway with the word principle he'd been repeating to himself all morning. Vivian recovered first, because Vivian always recovered first. She stood, smoothed her blazer, and offered the composed, gracious smile she reserved for people she hadn't yet decided how to handle. "Amara," her voice was warm, careful, testing the ground. "What a surprise. We were expecting." "The principal decision-maker from Bennett Rhodes Holdings," Amara said, stepping fully into the room, Marcus Whitfield a quiet, steady presence at her side. "Yes, that would be me." Chloe, who had come along to observe what everyone assumed would be a triumphant morning, looked between Amara and Ethan with open confusion. I'm sorry, I don't understand." "You're the woman Ethan was." She stopped herself, but not quickly enough. "Married to," Amara said evenly. "Yes, for 5 years." She let that settle for a moment before continuing, her tone never rising, never sharpening, simply stating facts the way she might read a deposition. "I should clarify, since I understand there's been some confusion. Bennett Rhodes Holdings has controlled this property, and a considerable portion of the coastline your company has spent 6 years trying to acquire, since long before I ever met Ethan. I am the sole heir and controlling trustee of the Bennett Rhodes family holdings. I have been for the last 4 years. Marcus opened a slim folder and set it gently on the table. "For the record, this includes controlling interest in 11 commercial properties, currently under negotiation or lease with Vaughan Development, 3 of which involve agreements Mr. Vaughan's company is currently in breach of." Richard Vaughan's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "That's not possible," Ethan said, finally finding his voice, though it came out smaller than he meant it to. Your apartment, your car. You worked as a paralegal, Amara. You told me. "I told you I had a law degree and I chose to keep my own name off certain documents," Amara said. "I never lied to you about who I was, Ethan. I simply never told you everything because for a long time I believed you loved me enough that it wouldn't have mattered if I had." She paused. "I was wrong about a lot of things. That wasn't one of the ones I regret most." Vivian had gone very still, her hand resting on the back of her chair as though she needed it to remain upright. Amara turned to her, and for the first time that morning, something in her expression sharpened, not into cruelty, but into a kind of clear, deliberate attention, the look of a woman who had been waiting a long time to ask a question. "You knew," Amara said quietly. "Didn't you, Vivian? Not everything, but something I have no idea what you're." 18 years ago, Amara said, "my grandfather and Richard's father were involved in a business dispute that was settled quietly and sealed. I only learned about it 2 weeks ago. I imagine you knew about it considerably longer than that." She watched Vivian's face, watched the careful mask hold and then, almost imperceptibly, begin to slip. "You've known the Bennett Rhodes name for a very long time, haven't you? Long before I ever brought a pecan pie to your Christmas table and you called it rustic." The silence in the room had changed texture entirely. Richard Vaughan turned slowly toward his wife. "Vivian, what is she talking about?" Vivian's composure, the thing she had built and maintained for 30 years, cracked, not loudly, not with tears, but with the quiet, brittle sound of something that had been under pressure for far longer than anyone in that room understood. "It was a business matter," she said too fast. "It had nothing to do with Richard. It was decades ago. It was settled. It was nothing." "You recognized the name the moment Ethan brought her home," Amara said. "It wasn't a question anymore. You didn't tell him. You didn't tell Richard. You just decided, quietly on your own, that a Bennett would never be good enough to sit at your table. Not because you thought I had nothing, but because you were afraid of exactly what I actually had." "That's absurd," Vivian said, but her voice had lost its certainty. Marcus Whitfield cleared his throat gently and slid a second document across the table, not toward Vivian, but toward Richard. "Mr. Vaughan, I believe you'll want to see this. It's a copy of a letter your wife sent to the Bennett Rhodes family attorney 11 months after your son's wedding, requesting that certain financial records regarding Amara's background remain, and I'm quoting directly, undisclosed to my son for the foreseeable future, given the sensitivities involved." Ethan turned to his mother so sharply that his chair scraped hard against the floor. "You knew," he said. "You knew who she was, this whole time. You knew, and you let me." He stopped, his jaw working, something collapsing behind his eyes that had nothing to do with Harbour Crown anymore. "You let me choose Chloe over her. You pushed me toward Chloe. Was that ever about class, or was it always about this? Were you protecting the family name or protecting yourself?" "I was protecting this family," Vivian said, sharper now, cornered. "You have no idea what that settlement cost us. You have no idea what her grandfather threatened to do to your father's reputation 18 years ago. I was not going to let history repeat itself through a marriage I never approved of in the first place. So instead," Amara said quietly, "you decided to humiliate me at a dinner table in front of my own husband and hope I would simply disappear quietly, the way you'd apparently been hoping I would since the day we met." Vivian said nothing. There was, for the first time in the entire conversation, nothing left for her to say that wouldn't make things worse. Chloe had gone very pale, standing slightly apart from Ethan now, as though the distance between them had been growing since the moment Amara walked through the door, and she simply hadn't noticed until now. "I didn't know any of this," she said, mostly to herself. "I thought, she told me you two had already been over for a long time before I—" "Chloe," Amara said, not unkindly, "I don't blame you for wanting something better than what you had. I understand that more than you might think. But you should ask yourself what exactly you were welcomed into this family, for I don't think it was ever really about Ethan." Chloe didn't answer. She was looking at Vivian, and something in her expression suggested she was beginning to understand the question far better than she wanted to. Richard Vaughan, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke, his voice heavy. "Mrs. Bennett, whatever has happened in this family, and clearly a great deal has happened that I was not aware of, I would still like to discuss Harbour Crown on its own merits. My company's offer stands." "I appreciate your directness, Mr. Vaughan," Amara said, "but I think you should know Harbour Crown was never really available. Not to your company and not at any price you were prepared to offer. My grandmother has held that property for a reason that has very little to do with real estate value, and a great deal to do with what happened between our families 18 years ago. I came here today because I wanted to see, in person, exactly what kind of company and what kind of family I would be dealing with before I decided anything." She let that land, watching Richard's face fall as the last hope in the room quietly extinguished itself. "I haven't made a final decision," she added. "I will in time, but I think we're done here for today." She rose, buttoned her coat, and turned to leave, then paused at the door, looking back not at Vivian, not at Richard, but at Ethan, who stood frozen by the window exactly where he'd been standing when she walked in, as if some part of him understood that if he moved, the last 5 years would become fully, irreversibly real. "For what it's worth," Amara said quietly, "I never wanted you to lose everything. I only ever wanted you to choose me. You had that chance more than once. You didn't take it. She held his gaze for one long moment. I hope Harbour Crown was worth it. She walked out. Marcus Whitfield followed a step behind, closing the door softly behind them, leaving the Vaughan family alone in a conference room with a view of a harbour they now understood, with sudden and total clarity they would probably never own. In the elevator down, Marcus glanced at her, his expression carefully neutral. That went about as well as it could have, all things considered. Amara looked at her own reflection in the polished steel doors, steadier than she expected to feel. It's not over, she said. Vivian will spend the next few weeks trying to figure out how much damage has actually been done. Richard will start asking questions about that settlement that his wife spent 18 years making sure he never asked. And Ethan, she paused. Ethan will have to decide what he actually lost today, and whether Harbour Crown was ever really the thing he wanted most. And you, Marcus asked, what do you want now? Amara thought of her grandmother, waiting in Charleston with a letter and a story 18 years in the making, and of the quiet, unfamiliar lightness in her own chest, something that felt less like triumph and more like the first full breath she'd taken in 5 years. I want to go home, she said, and hear the rest of what my grandmother has to tell me. Everything else can wait. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, and Amara Bennett walked out into the cold afternoon light, no longer the woman anyone at that table had ever bothered to truly see. Karma, consequences, and emotional freedom. The collapse of Harbour Crown didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most collapses do, quietly in a series of small withdrawals that only looked catastrophic once someone finally added them up. Within a week of the meeting, 2 of Vaughan Development's minority investors requested emergency calls with Richard Vaughan. Within 2 weeks, one of them pulled out entirely, citing concerns about leadership transparency, that everyone in the room understood to mean something closer to we've heard about the lawsuit that almost happened 18 years ago, and we're wondering what else you've been hiding. By the end of the month, the company's line of credit had been quietly reduced, and the whispers among Richard's old business partners had turned from concern to openly skeptical. Amara never had to make a single phone call to make it happen. She simply declined to renew 3 commercial leases Vaughan Development depended on, exercising rights that had always technically belonged to her family. She didn't threaten anyone. She didn't gloat. She let the natural consequences of 6 years of overextension do what they were always eventually going to do, with or without her involvement. You could have destroyed them completely, Marcus told her one afternoon, reviewing the final paperwork on her desk, called in every lease at once, made it impossible for them to recover. I know, Amara said. I thought about it for about a day. She signed the last document and slid it back across the desk. But that's not who I want to be when this is over. I don't need them to lose everything. I just need them to lose what they were never entitled to in the first place. Ethan moved out of the family estate 3 weeks after the meeting, into a small apartment across town that Vivian never once visited. He told himself it was about needing space to think, but most nights, lying awake in a bed that felt too large for one person, he understood it was something closer to needing distance from a version of his family he could no longer pretend not to see clearly. Chloe left first. It happened without a dramatic scene, just a conversation over coffee, both of them aware, in the way you sometimes are with a relationship built on convenience, that whatever they'd had together had depended entirely on a future that no longer existed. I think I always knew, Chloe admitted, turning her cup in slow circles on the table between them. Not about her family, about us. I think I knew this was never really about me. Ethan didn't argue. He wasn't sure he had the right to. His relationship with his mother took longer to unravel, and unraveled more painfully. Vivian never fully admitted what she'd done, not in the way Ethan needed her to. She offered explanations instead of apologies, reasons instead of remorse, until one evening, sitting across from her at a dinner that felt nothing like the ones he remembered from childhood, Ethan finally said the thing he'd been circling for months. You didn't just cost me Harbour Crown, he said. You cost me 5 years with someone who actually loved me before any of this happened, and I let you. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. Not you, Mom, me. Vivian had no answer for that. For the first time in Ethan's memory, his mother sat across from him with nothing composed to say, 6 months after the meeting in that conference room, Amara stood on the porch of a small foundation office she'd opened in downtown Charleston, watching a group of women file into what used to be a rundown storefront and was now, thanks to a portion of the Bennett Rhodes Endowment, a resource center offering legal aid, financial literacy classes, and small business grants for women rebuilding their lives after leaving situations that had made them feel exactly the way Amara had felt at that Christmas table, disposable, underestimated, quietly erased from their own stories. She'd named it, simply, the Evelyn Project. Her grandmother had cried the first time she saw the sign go up, though she would never fully admit it, and had instead spent 20 minutes critiquing the font. The rest of the story, her grandmother had promised her that Christmas night had turned out to be smaller and sadder than Amara expected. A business dispute decades old, a betrayal by a man Richard Vaughan's father had trusted, a settlement that had cost the Bennett Rhodes family more than money. It wasn't a story about revenge waiting to be collected. It was a story about a family choosing, generations ago, to build something quieter and more careful, instead of chasing the kind of recognition that had eventually consumed the Vaughans. Amara understood, hearing it, that her grandmother hadn't kept the property out of spite. She'd kept it because she'd learned a long time ago exactly what kind of people chased shorelines instead of substance, and she'd wanted to make sure her granddaughter would always have the power to say no to them. Amara saw Ethan one more time, almost a year after the divorce was finalized, by accident at a small cafe near the courthouse where she'd gone to finish some final paperwork for the foundation. He looked thinner than she remembered, quieter, like a man who had spent the last year being honest with himself for the first time in a long while and hadn't fully recovered from what that honesty had cost him. "Can I sit?" he asked. She considered it, then nodded. They talked for a while about nothing important, his new, smaller job at a development firm that had nothing to do with his father's company, her foundation, the strange, disorienting quiet of a life neither of them had expected to be living. Eventually, the conversation reached the place Amara suspected it had been heading toward the entire time. "Did you ever love me?" Ethan asked. "Or was I just part of a life you were testing out before all of this?" Amara took her time answering, turning her coffee cup slowly, the way she'd watched Chloe do once in a room that felt like a lifetime ago. "I loved you," she said finally. "Really loved you. The version of you I married, before your mother's approval became the only thing that mattered to you. That part was never a test, Ethan. That part was real." She looked at him steadily. "But loving someone honestly was never going to be enough to save you from a family that taught you love, was something you had to earn through obedience. I couldn't fix that for you. I'm not sure anyone could have, except you." Ethan looked down at his hands. "I keep thinking about that night, the dinner. I keep trying to figure out the exact moment I could have said something different, done something different." "There wasn't just one moment," Amara said gently. "There were 100 small ones, long before that dinner, where you could have chosen differently and didn't. That's the part that took me the longest to understand, too. That it was never really about the Christmas table. It was about every quiet choice that led up to it." She stood, gathering her coat, and for a moment looking at him, she searched herself for the anger she'd expected to still be carrying. She found instead something quieter. Not forgiveness, exactly. Something closer to peace. "I hope you figure out who you actually are," she said, "away from all of it. I mean that." She didn't wait for his answer. She walked out into the bright afternoon, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable day she'd spent 5 years believing she wasn't allowed to want, and didn't look back. That evening, she drove out to Charleston, to the house where her grandmother waited on the porch with 2 cups of tea, and the particular quiet that settled over the harbor at dusk. Evelyn had grown frailer over the past year, though her mind remained as sharp as ever, and Amara had taken to visiting most weekends now, unwilling to waste any more time than she already had learning to know the people who'd actually loved her all along. "You look lighter," Evelyn said, handing her a cup. "I feel lighter," Amara admitted, settling into the chair beside her. "Good." Evelyn looked out at the water, the same view she'd shown Amara all those years ago, the one that had once felt like a warning and now felt, finally, like an inheritance she was ready to hold without flinching. "You didn't need to destroy them to win, sweetheart. That was never the lesson I was trying to teach you." "I know," Amara said. You wanted me to learn the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can give them. And did you learn it? Amara thought of Ethan's face in that cafe, of Vivian's careful silence in the conference room, of the quiet, steady presence of Marcus Whitfield and her grandmother, and the women filing into the foundation office each week, rebuilding lives with the same patient determination Amara had once mistaken for weakness in herself. I learned something better, she said. I learned I don't need anyone to choose me in order to know my own worth. I already know it. I think somewhere along the way I forgot that. But I remember now. Evelyn smiled, reaching over to take her granddaughter's hand, the harbour stretching out gold and quiet in front of them. Generations of a family's careful choices settled into the ground beneath their feet. That, she said softly, is the only inheritance that ever really mattered. The sun went down slowly over the water. Amara stayed until the last light faded, no longer waiting for anyone's permission to belong exactly where she was. The end.